Hi folks, I'm Craig Taylor, and as always a huge thanks for joining me here on my YouTube channel, the Bushcraft Padawan. Over the past couple of months I've put out many videos. Some of them have focused on the subject of bearings. I put one out that talked about what is a bearing generally, and I mentioned that it was a way of describing the direction between two objects. I then put out a video that was talking about what is a magnetic bearing, and explained that that was a way of indicating the direction between two objects using a compass, and in particular the red magnetic needle in conjunction with the magnetic fields of the Earth. And I did promise a third video, and that's what this video is today. It's all about what I would call a grid bearing. And a grid bearing is a way of describing the direction between two objects using the grid lines on your map. And that's what we're going to look at in today's video. Before I do that though, just a little bit of context. When we talked about the magnetic bearing, you may recall I stood here in the video and I was taking bearings on different objects. When you take a magnetic bearing, your position is one of the points, is one of the 2 points that you're relating to. You're describing your direction between something, between you and something else. Your position is always one of the points. When it comes to taking a grid bearing using a map, your position may or may not be one of the points that you are working with. So sometimes it will be and sometimes it won't be. The times when I find that it's not my position is usually when I am planning a route in advance. When I am sat at home and I'm plotting my route card, I then tend to find those are the occasions when I am taking a grid bearing between two objects and I am nowhere near them. I'm at home and they're hundreds or thousands or tens of miles away. So just bear that in mind. Magnetic bearings, you are one of the points. With a grid bearing, you may not be one of those points. Now, let's have a look at this quite simple process, and then I'll join you back out here in the woods. I've got my map open in front of me, I've got my compass to hand, but before we start diving into actually taking the bearing, there's a few things that I want to draw your attention to. If you look roughly in the centre of the screen, you can see a trig point, a triangulation point, a triangulation pillar, with a height of 405 metres. And then just to the left and below that, you can see a spot height of 400 metres. And the actual spot height itself, it's difficult to see, is just above the point between the 4 and the 0. Look between the 4 and the 0, look just above it, you can see a small browny orange dot. That's the spot height itself. Those are two things I want to draw your attention to. If you also look over towards the right hand side of the trig point here, you can see that there is a blue line that is running up and down the screen. It's running up and down the map. I'm going to relate to that as well in the video. The final thing I want you to think about is think back to one of my earlier videos where I talked about the value of guesswork and I talked about the value of estimating. I'm going to be taking a grid bearing from the 400 spot height to the 405 trig point. From the 400 to the 405. Just look at that angle now. It isn't 90 degrees, but it's slightly more than 45 degrees compared to what I'm looking. So somewhere I'm looking roughly for this bearing to be between 45 degrees and 90 degrees, somewhere in that area there. So straight away, mentally, I've got something of a safety net in place in case I get my grid bearing calculation or the grid bearing process completely wrong. I've zoomed the camera out here so that you can get a better idea what's going on with my compass. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to position the compass on the map. Now it's quite important that you position it facing the correct direction. If you look at my compass here, you'll see that there is a direction of travel arrow There we can see it there. Now your compass, that may look somewhat different. It may be marked up completely differently, but it will have it somewhere on your compass. And it's important that that arrow is pointing in the direction of the bearing you are taking. In other words, on this occasion, from the spot height to the trig point. Placing it on the map like that would be completely in the wrong direction, because it would be facing from the trig point to the spot height. We would be completely out. So let me position that correctly. I'm now going to place it on the map. And what I'm going to take time to do is to make sure that either the straight edge on the edge of my compass, or one of these straight lines that's marked on my compass base plate, I'm going to take time to make sure that I use one of those lines to join up as accurately and as carefully as possible the spot height to the trig point itself. I don't rush this point, I don't rush this phase. If I rush it here, there's a huge chance that I'm going to get it wrong. So I take my time, I look over the top of the compass to make sure that this straight line is running through the spot height point, through the trig point. Then when I'm absolutely convinced that it's in place, I keep the base plate nice and still, and I turn my attention to this compass bezel here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to twist this compass bezel so that the red and black lines that are on the inside of the bezel, you may notice them here, these red and black lines, they are running parallel to the blue lines that I drew your attention to earlier. The blue line is on the map, the black and red lines on my compass are in the compass. I need to make sure that the black and red lines are parallel to the blue lines on the map. You'll also notice that I'm pointing with my pen to an orientation arrow here in the compass. That must be pointing up the map. It is possible to ensure that your lines are parallel, but you'll now notice that the orientation arrow is pointing down the map, completely out. The orientation arrow needs to be pointing upwards. The lines need to be parallel. Once I've done that, I check everything again. I check that my compass hasn't moved and that that straight line is connecting the spot height to the trig point. I check that my orientation line is pointing up the map, and I check that the lines in my compass bezel are parallel to the lines on my map. At that point, I can take the compass away from the map and I can read off the bearing. And the bearing is in degrees, because that's what we're working on. I'm using the inner measurement. The bearing is approximately 64 degrees. There you have it, a relatively simple process for taking a grid bearing between 2 points on the map. You may or may not be one of those 2 points. There is one final thing that I want to say though, and I'm not going to go in depth with it in this video, if indeed I ever go into some depth with it, because it can get very complicated. But when you have taken a grid bearing, as you've just seen in this demo, you may need to convert that into a magnetic bearing if you are planning on actually going out into the real world and using a compass and navigating along that bearing. There may be a difference between the two. Sometimes that difference is huge and you really do need to make the change, you really do need to convert it. Sometimes that change is so small that you need to be aware of it, but the compass isn't accurate enough to actually plot that conversion. And sometimes, although I've never experienced it myself, there may be no variation between a grid bearing and a magnetic bearing. There's a lot that is to be factored into this, and it's not the purpose of this video to go into it. Depends on where you are in the world, depends on when you are in time, because it's constantly changing. It depends on how old or how recent your map is. Lots of things to think about, but do please bear that in mind, that if you are going to take grid bearings, convert them to magnetic bearings, you will need to look into how to make that conversion. I may conjure it up in a future video, I may not conjure it up in a future video. As always, a huge thank you for taking the time to watch. If you're not yet a subscriber, click on the icon in this bottom corner of the screen and you will magically become one. And over in this corner of the screen is a playlist of all my navigation videos to date. As always, a big thanks for watching. Do feel free to comment below, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.